my great pleasure to introduce Maura Corbett, who will be offering our opening keynote for the day. Maura is the CEO and founder of the Glen Echo Group, a member of the Board of Directors for Public Knowledge, the CDT Advisory Council, and a Business Advisory Board member for the National Hispanic Media Coalition, among many other well-earned honors and recognitions. I also was told recently that Maura is one of those people that no matter what side of an issue you're on, her integrity and her honesty make her a real pleasure to work with, and a fan of people from all sides of tech policy. So it's without further ado that I welcome Maura to our virtual stage.
Well, I'm not crying, you're crying, Amy. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? I'm a little nervous about somebody just raise a hand and make sure you can see me. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I am so delighted to be here. I have such tremendous respect for Silicon Flatirons, for Amy, and not just because she has red hair, for Phil Weiser, and for all of the students and scholars that you produce that make tech policy better. I like to think that there is a third leg of the stool of law and policy, and I think that that is communications, which is what I'd like to talk to you about today for a little bit. So with no further ado, and thanks to everybody, here we go. Obviously, Amy has named this event for our times, trust and technology. Is trust dead? It's hard to build and it's easy to lose, but what is it exactly? If you asked 100 people, if I asked all of you today, we'd probably get 100 different answers. And all of them would mean the same thing, something you can't really touch, but you can feel and understand is some combination of honorability, consistency, reliability, sort of a mean what you say-ness. And really, when you get down to it, it's essentially a belief. It's something you have until you don't. Trust is an important enough thing that lots of high-priced consultancies all over the world track it and analyze it and try to assess its value, even though it's usually a moving target, and often it's like trying to hold water. I have a minor obsession with one of them, perhaps you've heard of it, the Edelman Trust Index, which is not produced by one of those consultancies, but from a communications company, which is probably why I like it, because they make sense of trust, or they know how to make sense of trust. Last year, the index found that people grant their trust based on two distinct attributes: competence and ethical behavior, doing the right thing and working to improve society. And they didn't think, by the way, that any of our central institutions, not government, business, media, or NGOs, were very competent or ethical, which is pretty sad. This year, unsurprisingly, trust in many of our institutions is pretty much dead, or at least it's very, very sick. It's disintegrating across the world, and in the US, it's pretty much collapsed altogether. Obviously, we've all been through a lot, and we're still going through a lot, and it's a profoundly difficult time. And the notion that people have lost faith has wide-ranging implications. But these times aren't as unprecedented, and oh my God, if I hear that word again, it will be too soon. It's not as unprecedented as we might think. Out of terrible times, industries and even revolutions are born. They grow and they mature. And we've seen this movie before. Those were analog, this is digital. And so here we are. For so many years, and many of us, names not to be mentioned, have been here from the beginning. And when we started, tech was all about unicorns and rainbows and fairy dust all the time. And it was great. We were wide-eyed and optimistic and drunk off all the possibilities to change the world. And as someone who's there, we really believed it. It was a privilege to sort of be there at the revolution, as Peggy Noonan would say. Now we have whiplash. Everybody says that tech is a dumpster fire. It's sowing the seeds of our demise, yada, yada. And of course, neither of those extremes is true. Just like anything else, technology just comes down to how it's used. Enter stage right, trust. So just like Monty Python, we are not dead yet. And since I am here today amongst the brightest minds in technology, law, and policy, I am not going to talk about those things. Though I will tell you a funny aside, my daughter, 8th grader, saw this on my calendar, Silicon Flatirons, and thought I was going to get my hair done. So as a communicator, I may not be doing a good job on my calendar, but my company's literal mission is to take the complexity of law, technology, and policy, and we work together to make it make sense for mere mortals. Sometimes I say that we're trying to make the world safe for smart people. What I want, though, to impress upon you is how connected communications is to trust. And that is why I call it the third leg of the stool of law and policy, technology, law, and policy. People can't trust what they don't understand. In fact, I would posit to you right now, and this is a good point of the speech, so pay attention. When it comes to trust, perception is reality. We may not like it, but that's the truth. And second, while we've seen this play before, there may be some reasons to think that this time might be different. And because you're probably bored already, I will start with a cautionary tale, something you may have heard of, GameStop. As we all know by now, a company called Robinhood built an entire business, an entire brand on serving the little guys without access to the same tools and access as the billionaire Wall Street class. Then in a single day, it completely blew up that brand, not because of reality necessarily, but because of the perception of broken trust. It's another really good word for trust. Trust is a promise. Your brand tells your customers what you stand for and what they should expect from you. As you deliver on that, you begin to build their trust. If you do, or if it appears that you do something to break that trust, you are in trouble. So when Vlad suddenly told his users that they could no longer purchase shares of those stocks last Thursday morning, he betrayed his brand's promise. I mean, my God, Vlad, the name of your company is Robinhood. So when you shut down the little guys, your own customers, while the hedge funds and the brokers and the traders carried on as usual, Robinhood wasn't really democratizing finance for all anymore. And worst of all, and this is important, it wasn't the fact that Vlad had to shut down trading. He did it without explaining why. Trust broken. Nobody wants to be Vlad. To repeat, being trustworthy is good for business. The PowerPoint scribe, as many of you know, the PowerPoint scribe of Washington, Bruce Mehlman, not only agrees with this, he notes that Axios recently called business the fourth branch of government, which is quite a statement. But with great trust and great power comes great responsibility. And with that, we come all the way back to tech. It's an incredible tool, but without trust, it's just a brick. So what's an industry to do? Well, since past is always prologue, let's see what history has to teach us. Organizational researchers observed that crises are almost always preceded by periods of frequent failures, where unsafe or unwise practices are tolerated. Number two, there is then a triggering event, an industrial accident, a failure, a hack, a breach. Then three, the crisis tends to bleed from one domain, think of the financial sector in 2008, into economic, societal, and/or political issues. Four, finally, the crisis is resolved. There are organizational improvements, cleanups, regulatory remedies, and trust must begin to be rebuilt. As we all well know, most of the time, it doesn't really matter what you're legally responsible for or what you think you're legally responsible for. It matters what people think you're responsible for. It might seem old-fashioned, but a strong organizational identity, dare I say, a moral compass, is still necessary in order to build and maintain trust. Back to Edelman. The Trust Index says that the single most important lesson it has learned after 21 years of doing this is that trust in business still relies heavily on ethical behavior. As I said earlier, nobody gets to jump the line. I have another tale to tell with regard to that, but this one happened more than 40 years ago and remains, at least to me, the case study for trust lost and trust regained. And that, of course, is Tylenol. Fun fact before we review, Jack McConnell, who helped develop Tylenol and the MRI, he was a real slacker, is the father of Phish keyboardist Paige McConnell. You're welcome. You can use that at cocktail parties. So as I said, this is the Uber case, no pun intended, of broken trust. And many of you may remember in October of 1982, 7 people died after ingesting cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules in Chicago. And defying conventional business guidance, Johnson & Johnson immediately recalled and destroyed every bottle from every store around the world. It was like 31 billion capsules, and it was $100 million worth. And it took full responsibility immediately without exception. Then it completely redesigned its packaging, adding a tamper-proof cap, which is an innovation we don't even notice today. The CEO did more than 50 national interviews. It did Johnson & Johnson did a nationally televised commercial and a media tour across the United States. The company told the public what it was doing and why, and then it got busy doing it. Why? Well, the VP of Communications pointed to the company's values, which were written back in the 40s by Robert Wood Johnson himself. And it stated the company's responsibilities were to the consumers and medical professionals using its products, its employees, and the communities where its people work and live, and its stockholders. Therefore, it was essential to maintain the safety of the public to ensure business continuity. So that's what Johnson & Johnson did. And that's why this is still studied today, not just by little old me. What has changed in 40 years? I mean, besides the commercial internet, which is why we're all here today, coffee break. I know that one thing has changed, that I no longer have giant hair and shoulder pads. One thing that is also different, that there is a much bigger desire for trust today than it was in 1982, which is surprising to some. But millennials who surpass the baby boomers as the largest generation of buying power, skipping over Gen X because everybody skips over Gen X, they demand that brands educate, influence, and advocate for change. Consumers now look to brands to be active instead of passive, again, filling the void that institutions have left. They think their brands should take stands and solve problems, and that influence is earned through empathy. Leadership, and action. And brands earn trust when they take that action. We saw this all throughout last year. Consumers regularly boycotting or buying products and services based on how they perceive them to be responding to societal problems, whether it's systematic racial injustice, the pandemic, and even politics. Then they wield that influence through social media and urge others to do the same. That is how companies like Robinhood can get blown up in less than a day. Trust is a living and breathing and quickly moving thing now. Business leaders are no longer beholden to just their boards and their shareholders. They're accountable to their employees, their customers, and their communities. And if you don't believe me, listen to the numbers. This year's trust index found, it's 2021, but it's looking back into 2020. 86% of people expect CEOs to publicly speak out on societal challenges. And businesses are responding. We see this. I don't have to go through the number of companies that have responded with activism against social and racial injustice. From a communications perspective, ask yourself if we saw anything like this in the 60s, 70s, or even 80s as a business response to activism. In fact, if you look back to the late 60s and into the 70s, it appears to be quite the opposite. Business leaders acted against what they perceived to be anti-business politics and deliberately mobilized amongst themselves, seeking to lock down their power and bolster their influence in Washington. Sort of the birth of the modern influence community we see today. And while today is different, it's still received wisdom in Washington that you play with who's in charge. Businesses need to get things done, and gunning for the person or party in charge tends to run counter to that. But not always. Enter the National Association of Manufacturers, not historically a bastion of progressive policies, but it was one of the first organizations, I don't know this for sure, but it may have been the first, to issue a clear, strong, and unprompted statement in support of the impeachment and removal of Donald Trump following the insurrection of January 6th, which we are unfortunately now watching again and reliving again with regard to the impeachment trial. that was extraordinary. I remember doom scrolling whenever it was and seeing that. And I remember telling myself, this is a moment in time. This is something different. Did it have the force of effective law? No, but the words mattered. And now we see it in the cascade of corporate PACs refusing to contribute to members of the insurrection caucus, as it were, or putting their PACs on hold altogether. More than half, 65% of people now think businesses should hold themselves accountable to the public and not just their shareholders and their boards. To return just for a moment to the persistent trust issues in financial services, 2 years ago, the head of the Business Roundtable, Jamie Dimon, remember him, made a commitment on behalf of his company and others at BRT that they were going to stop thinking of just shareholders and boards and embrace the larger corporate and social responsibility of their companies. Now, this was 2 years ago. The world was completely different. But here's an example of where perception is reality. I've personally not seen any evidence that members of the Business Roundtable have actually taken any action towards that stating goal. And the perception of the Business Roundtable versus the Chamber of Commerce, for example, isn't even a comparison. So again, communications matter. What's the lesson here for tech? Well, it's clear that brands must be, and still must be, values-driven companies, must assume responsibility for outcomes, and must affirmatively protect and save their brands. They must save the public or seek to protect the public from harm. And importantly, this is really important, avoid government intervention to solve their problems. And this is especially important for our world because decision makers are not by any means technology experts. And because while law and policy looks back, technology only looks forward. And that usually, as we all know, because this is what we do for a living, it makes for a giant mess. What makes it even more complicated is for all the talk about action and purpose, people don't necessarily walk the walk. And that can include us. I call it the Uber butt problem. Consider this from Edelman. 68% of people think consumers have the power to force corporations to change. And that same percentage of people, 68%, also think that businesses should step in when government fails. So how does this tension play out? Well, in the earlier days of Uber, you'd often hear something like, well, don't really like Uber, and I can't believe that that CEO guy said those things, but I really need to get downtown tonight, so I called an Uber. One of the things I'm most struck by in this moment is the question of how much trust are we willing to gamble for convenience? And we see this, of course, in privacy all the time. At what point is too much too much? And is there a point? Are there real differences between what people say and what they do? And then what is the responsibility of law and policy to respond to that? Oftentimes, it seems that people don't trust anything and they do it anyway. We all go from breach to breach, and most of us just get used to it and don't bother to change our behavior. I mean, I have 41 compromised passcodes and I don't have the time to fix them. Who bears responsibility for that? The companies, the government, or us? Instead of seeking for answers to these really hard questions, most people find it much easier to blame it on a boogeyman. And unfortunately, tech sometimes makes that really easy. So what does a brand do then in a modern fact-optional environment? It's kind of simple. Tell the truth. Day after day, channel after channel, put out reliable, consistent, and trustworthy information to all of your stakeholders. And don't forget your employees and communities because they will increasingly impact who trusts you. Guard the quality of your information. And that just doesn't mean the good news. This is a really important point. Communicating the bad stuff is almost more important, especially in the world of emerging technologies that seem scary and intimidating and confusing, like AI. That used to scare the crap out of me, and I sort of understand what it is. Or think of a data breach that your customers hear about on Twitter instead of from you. If brands are not out there talking to their customers and their employees, others are going to happily fill that void. And for all of you here today, please remember, people always favor more regulation of industries and technologies they do not trust, which is why the SEC is now investigating Vlad, and why 2 days ago they announced their first 2 in-house lobbyists. I'm sorry, I'm being mean to Vlad, and I don't mean to. I'm not being fair, but the example is powerful. Right now, we have lots and lots of questions and not a whole lot of answers. And events like this, with thanks to Silicon Flatirons and Amy Stepanovich, are critical to facilitating trust and even building trust among ourselves to try to make sense of an extraordinarily complex and interconnected and digital world. But what isn't and shouldn't be complex is trust. Trust is simple, but trust is hard. So in closing, let me leave you with a few guideposts, which are there if we look for them. When institutions fall down, when the government is incapable, people are turning to businesses to step in and fill the void. Do what you say and say what you do. Lead with facts, honesty, and empathy. Tell your story. Make it simple and compelling, and tell it consistently across all channels as many times as possible. They say you have to say something 7 times for people to even internalize it. Embrace the trust you've been given. Remember, it's hard to earn, but it's really easy to lose. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, I actually thought it was Mark Twain, but I looked it up. It was Abraham Lincoln. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Thank you very much. Oh, and I see some questions. We have a few minutes. Is that okay? I'm going to assume that's okay.
Yes, we actually have our first question from a student. Connor is on stage. Connor, if you'll turn your video and microphone on, we have his first question from a student.
Thank you for being here, Ms. Corbett. That was a great presentation. We appreciate it.
Please call me Maura, not Miss Corbett.
Thank you. So you mentioned the Tylenol example as sort of a contrast to the behavior that we've seen from a lot of technology companies in recent years. And I was just curious to what extent you attribute that to, you know, the individuals or personalities or internal kind of cultures of the companies themselves, and to what degree you see it as a factor of larger societal incentives, whether those are incentives crafted by government or the consumers or other kind of forces external to the companies in question.
Connor, that's a really smart question. The answer is, I think it's probably a little bit of all of those things, but I personally think that comes down to leadership at the top echelons of that company. Maybe it is because they were a consumer products company charged with, you know, not having people die from their stuff, that they felt an extra sense of responsibility. It was certainly something not done at the time. And there's a reason that is always the case that is studied, because they defied business wisdom at the time. You didn't do that. They took a real financial hit. You know, they went back to their core values and remained consistent with that pretty much against the advice of everybody else. Would something like that happen today? Honestly, I don't know. And with the complexities of social media and how fast stories move, I'm not sure it would be possible.
Thank you.
So we have another question from Teresa Ortega. Amazon is a company who exploits labor. What are your thoughts about this company?
Well, I will look at that through a communications lens. And this gets back to my point about making sure that your stakeholders to whom you communicate include your employees and your communities. Because now you see, and it's not just Amazon, you see it sort of across the digital economy, where employees are banding together to hold their employers accountable. One of the most extraordinary ones that I remember is Google engineers getting together, and I don't know, there were like 1,000 engineers or 100, I don't remember the number, saying that they would not participate in technology that enabled the Muslim travel ban. I think I said before earlier in the speech that employees and communities will play an increasing role in your brand and how people see your brand. So, you know, I'm not going to pass judgment on what Amazon is and isn't doing, but how you tell your story matters. And maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Mara, could I actually follow up on that a little bit and ask? I actually wrote down in my top takeaways from the conference, "Don't be Vlad," as a single takeaway. How do you talked about how he didn't message, he didn't explain to the people using Robinhood what was going on. And you just talked about messaging, like you need to communicate what's happening. When you're talking about really complicated tech issues, is there a way to do that for a lay audience?
It's, you know what, that question is the core of what we do at Glen Echo, and it's hard. That makes this a lot harder. You know, Connor asked about the Tylenol. That was a clear cause and effect. In a digital world, it's hard to find out, you know, the kernel of the issue. And that's why, you know, one of the things that makes me saddest as someone who's been in this world for 25 years is how little people invest in the telling of the story and in the educating of stakeholders and policymakers. I mean, it's not sexy, but technology is extraordinarily complex, and you've got to invest the time and sustained over time in trying to teach your stakeholders what your technology does and doesn't do. And, you know, that's the only way you're going to get good policy. And it's not sexy, but it's really, really important. And you've got to bring it down. That's sort of pejorative, but you know, you've got to make it really simple and easy to understand. And if you don't, you are going to get bad policy outcomes. I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out. And I don't mean garbage in the substance, but in the story. But I think that will be and continue to be a growing concern as we try to think about guardrails for the digital world, and, you know, what our social contract is going to be with regard to technology and our society and our democracy.
Thank you so much. That was
it's not a hopeful answer. I mean, it's why we're here today, right? And why we need a lot more events like this, so that we can try to tease out, you know, the threads that we really need to pursue and where we need to put our energies.
So I want to ask one more question from the chat from Ron Mayer in our last minute. He asks, what is your favorite book on being an effective communicator as an individual, or resource, I guess?
Oh, that's really interesting. I've never thought about that before. I do read a ton, and like almost it's sort of a problem because I'll read all night and I'll be exhausted and I have to go to work. But I honestly feel that reading stories, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, helps me perceive the world from the shoes of somebody else. And I think that's really important in communications, is not to talk at people, but to talk with people and to meet them where they are, which it's never been more important than it is now, as we are so polarized and we see communications as a zero sum, you know, somebody wins and somebody loses. Well, if that continues, even in our world, we're not going to get anywhere. If I think of a book, I'll let Amy know and tell you.
We will pass it on. Thank you so much, Maura. And there are a couple great questions. For all of you who didn't join us yesterday, we are having hallway track sessions during our breaks where you can talk to each other and delve further into these issues. Please join us for that. But in the meantime, we can't clap, unfortunately, but in virtually clapping to thank Maura for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
And congrats on a great event.
Thank you.
Bye.